Well, Grant, I think we are at a good number now of folks who have signed on. So I'm going to get us started
Okay.
and welcome everybody. I'm Charles Hokinson. I'm an MPP class of 1998 and also a member of the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association. On behalf of the HKS Alumni Association, I want to welcome everybody to this webinar, Thriving, Driving, and Evolving Your Career. I'm really excited to report that we had a very large number of people who have uh, registered, and so we may be having people join us in progress. And we had people register over a 40-year span of alumni from the early to mid 80s all the way to the class of 2023. And last year, we, as a Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association, surveyed you as an alumni body to get actionable feedback about the topics and the kinds of continuing education programming that you would like to receive. So hopefully this will hit one of the spots that you wanted to have some programming on. We are doing this in conjunction with the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Resources Office. And so I want to thank them for also being on today. Karen and Kristen from the HKS ARO are on, and we're happy to jointly pull together this event for you. I want to thank all the alumni for your ongoing commitment to the school, to our alumni family, to everything that you're doing professionally and personally to improve and strengthen your communities wherever you are around the world. And now I'm going to pivot and introduce our speaker. And we have a treat today. We're really fortunate to have an expert on leadership, an expert on transformation, organizational and professional and personal, an expert on work-life balance. And Grant Freeland is an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School. He's also an adjunct professor at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. And he's developed a course at the Kennedy School on lessons on career and life. And so we've asked him to speak a little bit about that today, about driving a career, evolving that career. He also is someone who's had an incredible career in consulting, and he's currently a senior advisor and senior partner emeritus at the Boston Consulting Group. He had a 32 or more year tenure at Boston Consulting Group, really focusing on client work, driving transformations in large organizations in both the public and private sector. That's given him a chance to really understand what it takes to have great leadership in organizations, what it takes to transform organizations, but also to do some reflecting, I think, about what it takes to transform and drive a career. And so with all of that, I'm just really excited to introduce Grant today and have him present to us. And he himself is an alum of the school. I believe he has a master's in public administration. And so he's also, like us, been thinking about our career. How do you drive it? How do you transform it? And the different sort of, inflection points on a career. I'm going to ask everybody to, if you have questions, to please put them in chat. Grant is able to take some questions during the presentation that he's going to give. But if we put the questions in chat, I'll be able to choose the timing of when we introduce some of those questions. And then when we get to a period of live Q&A at the end, then we will open it up for live Q&A, and you can raise your hand and be called on. But please put your questions, if you have any, during the presentation in chat, and then we'll figure out the right way for Grant to address them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grant. And thank you very much, Grant, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Charles. I was worried that you weren't going to mention the most important thing, which was I am an alum.
Yes, indeed.
Mid-career, MPA, class of 1993. I was 12 when I graduated. Now, just so you don't have to guess, my accent is Australian, so I'm an international member of the community as well. But I've lived mostly in the US since I graduated. And I do love questions, so I would love it to be two-way dialogue going on here. So do put your questions in the chat room. And I will cold call too, just like I do in my class. So Karina, get ready, because I'm going to probably cold call you very early on in the session. So the question my students ask me is, why did I get interested in these topics of careers and life? You know, if you look at my background from my career, I kind of did okay. over the 32 years or so at BCG, I ended up being one of the global partners, one of the global leaders. So I did okay. So why was I interested in sort of the theory of careers? And then on the life side, while my parents didn't go to college, all my siblings did and have done well. I now have a fantastic wife. I have 2 great children. Why would I have an interest in life? And so I asked them a question. And I'm going to ask you this question, and that's why Karina, I'm going to cold call you on this first one here. So if I sort of map, as a ex-consultant, I have to have a chart. I'm sorry, it's bad, I know, but anyway, we have a chart. So the way that we read this chart is on the vertical axis, I have career success, and I use the word career success because there are lots of definitions of success in life. Career is just one of them, but I ended up pretty strong at BCG. And then the time is the 32 years of my BCG career. I'm just going to do that until I left. And, we can debate where that green star, should be, but we'll put it in the top right. 32 years, fairly successful. Now, I'm interested in the shape of the curve from the 0, 0. So right at the bottom left, shape of the curve. If you drew something from the bottom there up to the star. So as I said, Corinne, I'm going to cold call you. What would be the shape of the curve or the line that would connect those 2 points?
I would think, well, it should be an ascending line, but with, ups and downs.
Okay, this ascending line, ups and downs. Okay, good. David Calvert, I see you as well. I'm going to cold call you. What shape would you have for drawing the dots between the bottom left and the top right?
Well, it's really it's a career is all kinds of dips and valleys and ups and downs, and the main thing is that your self-satisfaction as you go and I've taken huge drops in salary for self-satisfaction in terms of doing something that really mattered to me. And so to me, it's like there's no one set pattern.
Awesome. That's right. That's good. So this for me, this is me. This is not anyone else. This is just me. And so some people will just say, obviously it's straight line and that's not the answer. But I tell you, there are people who think that, my life was just one big, constant success. Some people will talk about how it goes up, you improve and stabilize, improve and stabilize. But this is actually my career journey was this. So not only was it ups and downs, I almost got outplaced at BCG twice. So let me tell you that story. So I had a great first year. So it's going up here. And, I was able to bring my analytical skills, my thought skills, my people skills, and things were going well. And then the very top of the first year, I was put on a pricing case for a credit card company. So this is a for-profit company. And I had to create this very complex spreadsheet, which would price what they should charge retailers for the volume of transactions and the average value. And so it was this big complex spreadsheet. Now, have any of you done DISC before? It's like a behavioral profile survey. And I'll give you a quick description. You might want to write this down on a piece of paper. If you're a D, it means you're sort of a driver, getting things done. If you're an I, you're interpersonal. It's inspirational. If you're S, you're steadiness, you're into process, bringing a team along. If you're C, you're conscientious, detail orientation. Okay, D is driving, I is interpersonal, S is process, and C is detail. Now, if you were thinking about if you had a personality preference for work, and I was creating this very complex spreadsheet, which of those 4 letters might be useful? Would be better suited to doing complex spreadsheets? Karen, do you have any view, or anyone else wants to yell it out?
I would say C.
Yeah, C would be good, right? Conscientious detail. That would be good. And probably some S too would be good, right? Because that's process. You would figure out how to do it and how you would involve that and how do you get the teams a lot. So you'd want to have S and C. Now, you guys don't know me really at all. But what do you guess my 2 letters are? I'm an ID. I'm an ID. I like people, I like connecting, I like inspiring people, I like getting stuff done, driving stuff, right? So asking me to create a complex spreadsheet was about the hardest task you could possibly get me to do. And I hated it, and I was fucking shit ass at it. And so there I was working all night trying to create these bleeding spreadsheets with all these complex cells and getting myself caught up into these loops. You know, and so I was on this thing for months, and then I eventually got through it. But my career is like coming down a little, you know, coming down now this first curve. So then, and then, Sanjian, what do you think my second case was? If you were guessing what I was then put on as the next time after a pricing case, I'll help you. It was another pricing case because I had just done a pricing case, and that one was equally bad. It was complex and hard. So here I am coming down. My career is going down the crapper. And then what do you think? So then on the third time, so where the staffing was done in consulting at that point was a partner would look at who's available and other partners would call in and they would say, I need a consultant. And the walls in the office weren't very thick at the time. And so I was outside this office and I heard the staffing partner say, he's the only one available. Talking about me. He's the only one available. It doesn't make you feel good, let me tell you, when you hear this. But I was put on this case and I actually reframed it. There were pricing elements to it, but actually it was much more around how this client was working with their client. And we framed it to a customer service issue. We then got into some R&D issues. And then the partner at the time said it was the second best case review he had ever written. So I was kind of coming down out of this. And the question is, well, why didn't I leave at this point? Because, you know, particularly when it was going so badly, this dip. And I didn't leave at the time because I kind of thought I liked the job that people were doing ahead of me. And I thought I could do that job, but not this job very well. My brother told me never leave a job at the bottom. And then my tenacity kicked in. And I just felt like I just worked through it. But it's debatable whether I should have left. And I'm not saying it's the right answer for him. Anyway, so I went up this thing. Things were going well. And then I was actually doing, I went to the Kennedy School. I did my second master's, my mid-career, transferred to the Boston office. Things were going well. And then I was coming up for election to partner. This is the second dip. Now, to get promoted to partner, you have to have 80% of the local partner group vote for you for it to go to the region and then the global view. Okay, so the question is so 80% to get through, what was my first vote? What do you think my first vote was? I got 20%. And the former head of the region who became my sponsor said to me, he said, Grant, the problem you have is everyone else tries to walk around proving how smart they are. You don't have that as a goal. Therefore, they don't know how to judge you. Therefore, they don't want you part of the club. But he believed in me, and we were doing big transformative change here, which sort of fitted my DI personality a bit more. So they get me another 6 months more. And what was my second vote, Karen? My second vote, you needed 80, I got 50. Now, normally that's the last vote. You don't get a third vote. So I was about to be outplaced. But the former head of the region pounded the table, said, give him 6 months more. He did. I was doing really well in this big transformative change. And then the third vote, I got 100%. And then from then, my career to kind of the highest part of BCG happened as fast as you can. It sort of played to me who I was and who my profile was. Now, that's the career side on this thing, but there was a life element to it. So I've had three episodes of mental health that all required medical intervention, 2 episodes of clinical anxiety, and 1 episode of clinical depression. When do you think those happened on my career journey? I won't ask you, but just think about it. So where would you think those 2 episodes of clinical anxiety happened and clinical depression? Now, most people think they happen in the troughs, but the clinical anxiety happened in a trough and the clinical depression happened at a peak. And the second clinical anxiety happened at a super peak. And if I just go back to the story here, so that first dot of clinical anxiety, this is when I was developing these spreadsheets from hell. And this is when I was really struggling. So I couldn't sleep at night. When I did go to sleep, I couldn't get out of bed at the morning. I was over drinking on Sunday nights to sort of numb myself for the week ahead. And I saw a clinical psychologist who did hypnosis therapy, who saw that I had low self-esteem, imposter syndrome. I bet you if I did a little survey of this group, there would be a large number of people with imposter syndrome. I was just waiting to be found out that I was a fraud, and this bad spreadsheet stuff was just reinforcing me. You know, it was external reinforcing they were bad at this job. But actually, the fact that the therapy helped and then things going well allowed me to be this roller coaster. This clinical depression happened just after I was at the Kennedy School. So I transferred from Australia to Boston. I didn't have a friend group. I had just broken off with my girlfriend. And things were going well on the work front, but I was just in a dark place personally. You know, suicidal thoughts, just blackness of how I was operating. But I was functioning, my executive function skills were high. And so, you know, fortunately, I was working in Boston at the time, living in Boston, and so I just disappeared and saw a psychiatrist. And for about 6 months, I had classic psychoanalysis. This was sort of before the contemporary drugs. And, you know, that therapy together with meeting my future wife, getting a friend group, got me out of that period. Now, so I thought these episodes were episodic and not chronic. And then for 20 years, I never had an issue. But then in 2020, during COVID, during the racial inequality, the income inequality issues, the political issues in North America, in USA, I should say, just meant that I was feeling sick to my stomach in the mornings and sick to my stomach when I went to bed. So I decided to see a clinical psychiatrist. I thought I'd go on drugs. I didn't then, but I have since. And that helped. And I think that together with, you know, various changes in the US at the time got me out of that episodic issue. Now, the reason why I share this is why I got interested in careers in life. And this is why I created a course at the Kennedy School for Careers in Life, because, you know, life is not linear and mental health issues come along the way. And is there some science and learnings and experience we can share? And it's particularly important for the Kennedy School students because the world is the oyster for Kennedy School students, but the ability of the variety of jobs and careers is so broad. So that's why I created the course. We did it for the second time last year, and that's what I'm going to share some of it now. But I'm happy to answer any questions now or later, and if you want to put them in the chat room, you can see I'm very open about my personal stories about this. But what I want to cover for the rest of the time is sort of career through several lenses. Career through the well-being lens first, and just share a little bit of that, and partly because it's important for all of us in our well-being, but actually career success is also influenced by our well-being. Then I want to talk about what drives satisfying careers. What does the science say about that? And then finish around sort of when you want to make trajectory changes to your career. You know, how do you leverage networks? And how do you think about sort of if you want to reinvent yourself? So that's what we'll talk about in the session today. So let's just start a little bit with this well-being and happiness. And I'm going to use happiness and well-being interchangeably. It's the research tends to use both, but it uses happiness not in the narrow sense of like, I enjoy my back massage. It covers it. And I'll define it in a minute. But it's sort of interesting that happiness correlates to job performance. Those who actually have high well-being or happiness receive more positive peer and supervisor reviews. That they actually do it ex ante. They looked at people's happiness and well-being and they found better employment, higher salaries, and so on. And just to be careful, this is not ex post. So it's not like we're interviewing people who are successful. This is interviewing people first and then seeing how successful they become. So it's sort of predictive as distinct from simply descriptive. And it's kind of funny that they've actually done a whole series of experiments where they give people positive emotions before they test them, images, get them to reflect on positive thoughts. And in almost all cases, people do better on the task if they actually are in a sort of in a happier space. The exception to that, though, is things like auditing. So I don't want to criticize any of you who are auditors, but apparently if you're not in a great mood, you actually might be a better auditor. So let's just ignore auditing and just say everything else. Actually, if you have higher well-being, you're going to be better at task. And working on people who become happier, the research says you can not only feel better, more creative, you have better relationships, you actually have higher productivity at work. So actually, this is a good thing to have from a career point of view, as well as a life point of view. And I just love this quote. It's a famous quote, but I love it, which is success is not the key to happiness. Happiness is the key to success. So well-being is an input to your successful career, not just an outcome of having a successful career. So I'm not going to, I often do polling on this one, but we're not going to have the time to do it today. So just think yourself about how much of your happiness is predetermined genetically. Just in your own mind, think through it. So how much comes from my genes? Then think, if you take that out of it, how much is driven by your circumstances, your job, your wealth, your status? And then the third part is going to be, how much can you control, your agency? So just have those in your head. How much is genetic? How much is driven by your circumstances? How much can you influence based on that? And this is about 10 years old, but the data is still pretty interesting, which is about half of our well-being is determined by what they call a set point. This is your genetics of where you are. And only about 10% is driven by your circumstances, your wealth, your titles, and so on. And that you have about 40% you can influence your well-being. Now, obviously, you need to be careful of averages, and actually the research more recently is that it's not quite 40, it's probably lower than that. And obviously mental health issues come into play here, like my serious issues of clinical anxiety and depression. But what I say to my students is that you have a lot of agency, independent of the exact percentage. You have a lot of agency to work on your well-being, which will help you in your career. And when I'm defining well-being, it's the positive emotions, which is the happiness, the small h happiness. You know, are you engaged in what you're doing? You know, there's a whole concept of flow we could talk a lot about, which is, are you doing work that's challenging to you, but you feel like you have the capabilities, so it actually motivates you? Have you found meaning in what you're doing? Do you have positive relationships? Do you feel like you're accomplishing something? And the reason why I teach careers and life together is it's like an intersect, they like bounce on each other. Because I'm going to show you what drives a good career, and it's almost the same as this, which is why this is why I sort of teach these things together. So if this is what a good well-being does it, how can you improve on it? And I suspect many of you have seen the research on hedonic and eudaimonic. Hedonic meaning things like it's the physical, the relaxation, comfort, pleasure, and fun. And then eudaimonic is meaning and purpose and so on. And the research is incredibly clear that hedonic gives you short-term hits in well-being. So it does improve it, but it actually evaporates very quickly. And it evaporates very quickly because you start comparing yourself with others, you have rising expectations, and so it never lasts. And that it's on the right-hand side, the meaning, the purpose, that are you achieving something that actually drives long-term well-being. And again, when we look at the drivers of career satisfaction, it's almost always the stuff on the right that actually drives not only a good life, but also career satisfaction. Now, I did want to show this chart because a big issue in my students, and I don't know if it's a big issue for you as an alum, is this question of money. And, you know, one of the things I say to my school is like a half a mile to the right of the Kennedy School is the business school, and a half a mile to my left is the divinity school. You know, at the divinity school, they're not debating money. At the School of Business, they probably are debating about money. And Kennedy School students are caught right in the middle. And I think it's a tension that a lot of my students face, and I expect a lot of you face. Now, the way to read this chart, now this is sort of the most recent research, and it basically is, look, there is a correlation between wealth and happiness, but it's not always what you think. The blue chart is your reflection on your life. So it's a retrospective. How am I feeling? And that clearly goes up from low salaries to high salaries. But if you look at people's experienced well-being, day to day, it flattens out. It used to sort of, the earlier research that it flattens out at about 100,000 US. This is probably more like, you know, 150 to 250 household income. And that's a lot of money. I'm not saying that's not a lot of money, particularly in some of the jobs we are. But what it does say, we're on this thirst for increasing salary, there's absolutely marginal, it flattens out, and there's marginal return on this thing. And I found this very helpful, you know, because my job was a well-paid job, but there were a lot of people who were always worried about the extra dollar, and they were earning so much money, they were off the chart here. And so I think as people think through their careers and think through their choices, they recognize that actually the marginal dollar is there. But I said, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, and I'm not saying those on low salaries don't have low well-being. It's clearly that they're true. So, the students asked me to summarize my views, which is earning very little totally has an impact, but earning a lot has marginal value. We can debate where it is and obviously what country you're in, where you are within a country influences that. But actually comparing is the big issue. That's the big issue around compensation. It's when you start comparing with the others. And I say to my students, which is, if you're going to do social good and all your friends are private equity players, you better be really comfortable that your social good is what you want to do and that you really find value, because otherwise you'll be constantly comparing them on a wealth point of view. And that actually is the destructive part more than the dollars. Charles, let me pause here. I'm going fairly quickly. Let me pause, and I am going to go to sort of some of the career learning in just a second. But are there any questions that are coming up that would be helpful to jump in? And totally cool if there's not. Charles?
Grant, I have not seen any particular questions come in. There have been a couple folks who appreciated your honesty and talking about some of the mental health challenges. There's some comments about, the well-being being the resource our decisions should optimize for, the importance of relationships. You had a lot of folks that were weighing in with short comments that were very much in agreement with the things you were talking.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And as I said, please ask questions if you want. So now the question is, well, how do you improve your well-being? And I'm just going to show you one slide. And this is these look like things that your grandmother or grandfather probably told you. But these things have all been scientifically shown to improve your well-being. Gratitude, optimism, acts of kindness, coping, forgiveness, goals, religion and spirituality, meditation, physical activity. And I get my students to experiment with one of these things during the semester, and they have to score themselves. And that's interesting. If you look at them at the end, will they continue it? This is my actual class. All of this, we had really 80% basically said they can continue with these exercises. I want to just touch you on one. My favorite hour of the year actually is this gratitude one. So what we do in my class is that 6 students get to give live gratitude to someone in the class. And they either do it to someone in the room or on Zoom, and they read a 3-page letter of gratitude to them. And, one of them read gratitude to a woman who became a de facto mother when her parents died when she was 14. And she just wanted to thank her for saving her life, was what she said. Another guy wanted to thank his mother, who raised them as a single mother, who worked in special ed in London. And he just wanted to thank her for what she had done for him and his 2 brothers, and what the job she did as a special ed teacher meant for the world. And the rest of our students are just watching. We're just passive observers in this thing, and we're just crying in this thing. And, of course, those receiving the gratitude found it valuable, but those giving the gratitude found it wonderful as well. And there's a terrific book by Sonia Labronsky about the How of Happiness, which I found very practical. If those of you who are looking for just actually very practical ways, and we can send the link out to that book if anyone's interested. But there's science behind this. The whole course is based on science. Let me switch now to, let me just switch then to careers, the careers stuff. And we looked at the work since the 70s. And then I've looked at what drives career satisfaction through. And I'm not going to go through this. This is actually probably my worst slide I've created. I'm going to create a better one for you guys next time. But the interesting stuff is, you go back to Hackman and just put your history hat back on. This was sort of like, Taylorism, for those of you who remember management. Scientific management was sort of at its heyday. It started with Ford, and people were into like productivity and efficiency. And I think he started to challenge that and actually started to say, actually, having some variation in what you do rather than just hitting one nail on a production line, having a degree of autonomy, actually having an ability to kind of complete a task rather than just an individual part, so doing something that has meaning, getting feedback. And so he started to change that just efficiency and Taylorism didn't make sense. Now then Clark in the the last century, then started bringing some practical things like pay and hours of work and so on. And then you sort of now we're getting to much more around engagement and purpose becoming more important. Who are you working with became more important. And so if I wanted to summarize what I think the science says about people who are most satisfied in their careers, it's people who are finding interesting, engaging work, that the work actually matters, and you have to enjoy the work you're doing. And actually, if you can find work that you enjoy doing, you'll stay longer in a job. And actually, if you can help people enjoy their job, they're more likely to stay. There's actually some research came out last month on that. You know, finding meaning and accomplishment. If you have agency to do stuff, but you work in teams, that people, you know, you need to have, you do what you want. That it's the people you join. People used to ask me what practice group they should join at BCG. And I would always say, go join the group with the people you like. And that's so we had people with like PhDs in biochemistry working in retail because they found their people. It's where you're going to get when you grow. You know, I can't hear many people I talk to and saying, as long as I keep growing, I'm going to stay at this firm. And this personal growth is so important. Then, of course, it's got to match your lifestyle, your work-life balance, location, and pay. But I think these things, now, you can't always have all of this stuff, right? And you have to make trade-offs. And sometimes in your career, you'll make investments in things. I just always urge, though, my students, which is to be careful of investment mode. You know, how long are you going to do the investment to get the payoff? And if you're always investing and the long-term payoff is too long, just maybe rethink what you're doing. But I don't think there's anything surprising here, but I do think it's this. And so when people look at careers and jobs, these are the sort of criteria I urge them to look at. Now, that's the theory. So I'm going to now start going into like, how do you leverage this? How do you leverage like networks if you're wanting to transform yourself or change yourself or grow yourself? So how do you leverage networks? And then how do people think about reinventing themselves? I mean, I think the most common question I get into mid-careers, and we have a large variety of alumni here, you know, a lot about is how do you reinvent yourself? And there's actually some interesting science about some tips on reinvention that I do want to make sure that I go through. But does this list, I mean, it's not a surprising list, right? I mean, most of the stuff that when I did the research, we spent 1,200 hours developing this course because we wanted to look at the science behind all of this as we developed it. And when you summarize it, it looks like, well, that's pretty obvious. But obvious with science behind it, I'm quite happy with. You know, obvious non-science, not so happy. But does this surprise anyone? Does anyone have any questions on this? Does it look hokey? Is there questions around anything on this? If you're not in the chat room and if you want to put your hand up, that's totally cool too. Yeah, Karina, please.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know how to frame it, but we are part of a group of very privileged people.
Yep.
That can actually, most of the times, choose what we want to do.
Yep.
And we can, you know, factor in all of these things into our decisions. How does it work for people that don't have this privilege, that just need to go out and take any job in order to, you know, just bring food to the table? And I'm not saying that people with lower paying jobs don't get satisfaction and don't have personal growth on their jobs, but I've met, I mean, we're here in Mexico, at least I'm surrounded by lots of people who just need the income and they would take anything. And I don't know, maybe this is not a conversation to have today, but that's something that's, I don't know, that I'm
Karina, it's a great question, and privilege comes up a lot in my class. And in fact, one of my students asked a speaker, I have a lot of alumni who come to my class, and we get them to share stories, not because they cracked the code, but just to give a mirror so that my students can reflect on it. And one of the students asked one of the guest speakers, and they're all Kennedy School alumnus, by the way, you know, which is how should I feel about the privilege of using, you know, the Harvard network, which is not exactly your question, but it sort of set up that one of the dialogues into it. And I just tell them you should absolutely use the network, use your privilege to help yourself and to help others. So that's the first thing I say to them. So we recognize that we are privileged, but we recognize we should use it to help others. You not using it doesn't help anyone. Your question then about those who don't have the privilege is right. And I think you summarized it as better than I could, which is there are people who may not have the choices, but who do other work, like nurses and like teaching, you know, who actually find it interesting and meaning and find teams they like to work with, even though they may not have choice. Now, if you have zero choice at all, then all bets are off. I mean, it becomes like Maslow's need hierarchy, right? You got to fill your bottom one down the right, match your lifestyle, location, pay. I mean, that's the first thing you've got to do. And if that's the only choice you have, then we get into social politics, right? And social policy, which is not what this course is about. But we need to recognize that we have privilege. We should use it, but we should use it to help ourselves and help others. And Karina, the interesting thing, as I remind my students, is all the research about you feeling better is helping others is at the core of it. You know, it's like, it's not only good for them, it's good for you. So that's not really answering your question. It's a great question, but we recognize it.
Thank
So I do
you.
want to talk about networks for a minute. And I found this super interesting because I always thought that the best networks were the people I knew intimately. You know, these are the people who I'd worked very closely with. They were close friends. But there's a whole theory about weak ties that I wasn't familiar with. Maybe you guys are. But the argument basically says that actually the strongest networks that you can leverage are weaker ties, meaning that these people introduce you to new networks. And so this is why you actually want to network more broadly than you might think. And there's a very famous study that was done in the 70s. I mean, it's really old, where they actually looked in Boston at where people found their jobs. And the minority of them found jobs through close friends. And the vast majority of them found them through what they call weak ties. So, you know, 55% found that they got them with the people they contacted occasionally. 27 said that they got it from people who they saw rarely. And in the set, the reason why is it's expanding. So you have your strong ties, and then you have these weak ties. These weak ties introduce you to different networks that you're not part of. Andreas, you have your hand up. I'd be happy to answer it. Or David.
David, yes.
David,
I think David was first.
David, please.
Yeah, okay. I think that list is a good list, and it resonates for me really well. The list you had up a moment ago, but I just think that that you know, you're kind of, you know, maybe intentionally not dealing with the money side of it, and so I think to not say that what drives job satisfaction includes a sense of security and a sense of you know, economic wherewithal to live. You know, those things matter hugely, and would resonate with me too.
Yeah, I mean, David, it depends on who you are. So actually, I start off the class by drawing a 2x2. I hate to do that for consultants. A 2x2, but basically it has money on one axis and it has purpose on the other. And someone mute for a minute if they could. So I draw this axis, money versus purpose. You need to figure out where you need to be on that. Now, ideally, people would like to be in the high purpose, high money, but there aren't. And so I say to them, you need to figure out where you are. But I think the research also says you don't want to be what I call a monk, which is like no money or purpose. That actually doesn't make you typically happy either. But you need to figure that out. And so in my class, David, I don't give answers. But you need to find that out, and you need to figure out when you want to do that, because there's a timing sequence too in the career in this business. You know, you might start somewhere and go somewhere else. So I started as a consultant, and I actually made a fair bit of money, and I do what I love in teaching. That was my journey, but that doesn't have to be your journey. You know, others can start on purpose. So I raise these things and people where they want to be and where the money means to them. Where do they want to do it? And all I do on the money thing is I just sort of show that the marginal value at a certain point is not worth what you think it is. That sort of thing. Yeah. But I agree.
I fully agree with that too. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
And Grant, we had a comment from Wendy Fellman that Adam Grant's book, Give and Take, discusses some of this topic. I don't know if you want to address that or have any comments.
And so it's one of my favorite books, and it is part of my readings. If you ever want to get a copy of my syllabus, it has all the readings that I wish I had read earlier in my life. And Adam Grant is part of it. I'm a huge giver and taker, believe it. We do the survey. You know, and it goes to the point that actually givers are both most more successful. There are some certain conditions, and I won't try and summarize the book, but they are also very successful. And actually givers have higher well-being as well. But on this network, so I'm a huge fan of the book. If anyone reads it, Adam Grant, Give and Take. But the networking thing was interesting to me, and it was validated just last year, or maybe 2 years ago, I think the research just came out, where LinkedIn, together with HBS and Stanford Business School, did massive sample analysis, like 5 million data points to find it. And it confirmed actually that these weaker ties actually created stronger value for people than these strong ties in their network. Like, I'm going to get it wrong. I haven't read the article for a couple of years. I think it was like, if you have like 13 common links, that's the optimal number, because it's not actually no link, it's weaker. And I think here what they showed is that it's not the weakest ties, it's relatively weaker ties. It's like a U shape. The most close to you don't have the most value. Those that you sort of never have contact any value, it's this moderately weak ties. And it varies by sector. It's the weaker ties are more important in digital and new things and traditional jobs. But the point around that actually these networks matter, and these weaker networks, which gets into LinkedIn, because LinkedIn never existed when I was around, and so I was talking to an expert on branding and on LinkedIn, and they reminded me of the 11-minute rule, which is that you should all be spending 11 minutes a week on LinkedIn, liking other people's, adding comments to other people, and posting things. And so I really urge my students to try and get into the discipline, and I urge you to go get it, because this makes it so much easier to keep these moderately weak ties strong.
Grant, thank you. This is very engaging conversation. Love it. Thank Karina and Charles and everyone for organizing this. My question to you is about career stage and time.
Yep.
What have the science found about what drives happiness throughout a career in different stages of career? Perhaps if you can recreate the conversations you have with MPPs and with mid-careers, and how perhaps the motivators tend to change, or do they stay the same?
Yeah, I think, look, there's no doubt that if you look at well-being over time, people get happier. It sort of goes, I don't know if you can see my line here, it kind of goes like this. It gets happier to people like into their like 70s. People are in that peak happiness often when they're younger, and they're in their like 80s, 50s and 60s, actually, and 70s. And then of course that goes down. So there's a wellness curve that actually exists that correlates to age. I think there are some factors that what people look for. I mean, look, it's obvious, right? Which is when you get into family period, people's priorities often shift and change, and that has a big impact on what people's priorities are. You know, there are people who would argue that over the time, sort of people look for like financial stability early on, look for sort of like power, and then look for respect. I think there's a cycle of that happens over time. That may be more privileged, Karina, but I think there's sort of a cycle that goes over that in time that people look for. And then the money stuff goes along a little bit that too, particularly when you're in the peak earning period and peak family period, where financials often kick in as being most important. So I think there are things like that. I also think it's very dependent on the individual too. So I think you do have some of these macro changes, macro trends, but I think you do have some of these individual stuff. There's a whole conversation we could have about what I call the third act, which is those who have finished their traditional career. So first act is education, second act is careers, for your traditional career, and the third act is the post-traditional career. So I'm in my third act, which is my teaching act. There's a whole lot of science around that too. And the thing, I wrote a column in it in Forbes, how you don't want to be an FIP. You know what an FIP is, Charles? Formally important person. You don't want to be an FIP. And and part of that is like planning. You want to plan your life as rigorously as you plan in your organization. So many of us spend so many fucking hours developing plans for our organization, and we work on them every year and we update them every year, and we never have a personal plan. And we never think about the optionality of where we're heading and how we're going to do it and so on. But anyway, that's a long answer to a short, great question.
Grant, we actually have had a couple different comments coming in about, are there differences between men and women that the research is showing? We've had a number of folks talk about trade-offs between career and marriage, children, the mommy track? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question, and I don't pretend to be an expert on this. You know, if I know something, I say something. And we have Professor Hannah Riley Bowles. Do you know her? She's like an expert on gender and negotiations, and I get her, and she teaches one of my classes and brings in a lot of stuff on this. So I'm not going to say I'm an expert on those issues. There's an excellent article in my course though, which gets more to the generic issue of working couples. We get into that into my course, and obviously, you know, on working couples, historically it's been a tougher issue for women, but there are some interesting cycles that people go through, and there are some ways to sort of like think through it and to actually work together as a couple. It's an HBR article, but it's actually pretty good. And if we'll figure out a way to get my syllabus out and or the readings out if people are interested. But I'm not an expert on the gender differences, and so I'm just nervous about going too far down there. I'm sorry. But we cover it in the course through Hannah. Yeah. There are also differences internationally, which we're not going into now. You know, different cultures have different issues, you know, different ways of working, prioritizing different things. Families have different issues, career success, you know, patriarchy issues play out, but we're not touching on those as well. I do want to talk about those people who are thinking about changing sort of their career identity or their career substantially. And there's a very good book. There are a couple of good books on this, but there's a book by Professor Bani Hamara called Working Identity, which is pretty interesting around that. And then there's a lot of stuff that's bringing design theory. You know, for those of you who work in industry or in technology or product development, design theory, you know, talks about how that if you want to reinvent things, you do it in small, agile ways rather than, you know, spending a lot of time thinking and then sort of trying to execute. And that I will summarize all of that thinking in a couple of ways. One is, the first thing I remind people is that there's no one true self. That every one of us could be something, could be quite happy in several different alternatives, different geographies, different careers, different roles. And that too much we try and find out, we try and reflect on what is the one perfect me. And I think that's just not that helpful. You know, this is an illustration of people, you know, and I had one of my students, a mid-career, who was a politician from South America who had some horrible things happen to him before he came to the Kennedy School. And when he talked about this, he wrote his paper on the fact that this was liberating for him because he only had one sense of who he was, which was to go back to his country, get into politics, and have all the risks associated with that. And then recognizing that there could be multiple versions of himself allowed him to like open his aperture for things that he could do, and therefore he could reflect. And one of the things we do on this in the course is we get people to think through sort of 3 odysseys, 3 journeys they could take off in life, and to flesh those out and what they could look like. And actually, are they independent? Could they be integrated in some ways? Are they sequential in some ways? But trying to think through, you know, multiple versions of yourself is really healthy. And also not only just thinking that unless I get to X, that's the only way I'm going to be happy, but also thinking through ways that you could explore different paths. So no one true self. The second one, and this is actually one of the most interesting one for the mid-careers, is that I think a lot of mid-careers think that if they're going to go from A to B, they're going to do it in one step. You know, they came to a background in non-for-profit management in countries, and they want to actually go to finance, you know, investing in financial, you know, good causes, ESG investments. And it's very rare that you actually make these single step jumps. Now, it could be easier from an MPP who's lower in the hierarchy and less experienced, maybe making a jump, but particularly as you get more senior, it's very hard to make these jumps. And typically you get there. It's not saying you can't get from A to B, but you might get there going via C, D, and E. And that therefore you need to think about where you want to go, but also the steps that are going to get there. And having a sort of a view that you can just make these huge leaps is actually kind of wrong. And the science is not on your side typically for making huge career leaps, particularly as you get more senior as you go up. And the last thing I talk about when people are thinking of reinventing themselves or thinking through it, is that Kennedy School students and alumni are really good at the thinking drives the doing. And they almost think that if they spend more time reflecting, thinking, going off to a retreat about what they're doing, they will figure out what they want to do. But they miss the half the equation, which is, but the doing drives the thinking. Meaning that you need to experiment to learn, not only to see what you like, don't like, who you want to work with, but without doing that, it's purely a theoretical exercise. And this is sort of the design theory. It's better to get quick feedback and reactions to stuff than it is to just try and think, and then hope you're going to end up somewhere. And so when I say experiments, what am I talking about experiments? You've got a career, you're working on something. Experimenting can be as simple as talking with people. That can be the simplest form of experimentation. And part of my course is that students have to talk to 6 people outside of the class. And I ask them to talk to alumni. 3 of them, though, have to be in sort of careers that you think could be interesting. And you talk to them. Tell me about the job. What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? How do people get there? How do people get from where we are now to that sort of career? What capabilities do you need? And you're experimenting at the minimum level by talking. But you could do internships, you could volunteer, you could go on boards, volunteer boards to see, do you like to be on boards? Which parts of boards do you like about? If you can volunteer for projects in your company. If you sort of want to make a switch to more finance, want to take the more switch to human resources, wanting to do something, work in the field, you could go and take, short-term projects. So you want to do this stuff, not just think about it. So it's the thinking drives the doing, but the doing also drives the thinking, and you need to experiment. And actually, this is particularly true for those of you who are thinking about your third act, your act 3, your next career. You want to, well before you get anywhere near that third act, have done a series of experiments to see what you like, throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks, so to speak. So let me just pause. We've had some questions. Before I sort of summarize thought, Charles, is there anything there or to hands up? I would be delighted. I will finish exactly on time, so you don't have to worry about that. But where else could be interesting before I finish up?
We had a great comment from Kim Hacker mentioning that a saying that's really helped her along the path, both as a career woman and as a mom, was thinking about stop comparing yourself to the you that you thought that you were supposed to be. And she mentioned that was especially important for high achievers, for those who love that gold star.
Yeah, I love that.
And then we've also had a couple people who have asked if we might be able to get a copy of these slides or even the syllabus for your course.
Yep, we'll figure out how to do that. And I see Morgan has their hand up. Morgan, jump in, please.
Thank you so much. This is Morgan. Quick question on you spoke a little bit about comparing to others, and that comment just there about comparing to an imaginary version of yourself.
Yeah.
One I wanted to ask about was looking up to role models or mentors.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything in terms of impacts of helping people make decisions and find their way through by looking to others that they admire or that they're impressed by, things of that nature?
Yeah, Morgan. So we have a whole section in my course. I had to turn my 13 classes into 1 hour. We have a whole conversation and about mentors and sponsorship. And I'm going to suggest to you guys that you don't want mentors, you want sponsors. And what I mean by the difference, which is different from a role model, I think having role models is great. So I'm going to put that aside. But when it comes to sponsors and mentors, I'm going to say you want sponsors, not mentors. Mentors give you advice. Sponsors pick up the phone or send the email or the text to help you. And that, so a sponsor can be a mentor, but a mentor is not a sponsor, if you get my point. So mentors can be helpful. Having people who can give you advice, that's great, but you really want sponsors. And the question then is, well, how do you get sponsors? I mean, it's interesting. In my class, probably only 25% of them felt that like they had a sponsor, someone who would really pound the table for them. Before when I was explaining my own story about how I didn't get outplaced, after 3 votes, this guy who was helping me, he was my sponsor. He was there pounding the table for me, making sure that I got a 3rd vote. That's what you want. Now, in my experience, actually, if you want to look for a sponsor, they're often the people who are sponsoring the most people already. They're not actually the people who have the capacity. It's actually because they often have D in their DIS profile. And actually I in particular, actually I more than I, but they won't have D, but a lot of I. There are people who just like to. Don't feel like you have to reciprocate to them, because there's probably often nothing you can do but to be respectful if they ask you for stuff. And then what I say to my students is, see how you can get in their way in the positive sense. You know, can you do something for them? Can you get on a project with them? Can you get something that engages them on it? I don't find, as you know, I sponsor a lot of people. I don't find people asking me if I would be their sponsor helpful. But people who get in my way, get interesting, we get going together, then I will kind of do it for them. So try and find a sponsor more than a mentor. You know, one's passive, one actually acts on things. Look, I'm sensitive to the time. I love talking to HKSs. As you can see, hopefully I have passion around this stuff. I love these things about well-being and career success. And I wish I had known this stuff. You know, this is not the old me. It's like, I wish I had known this stuff, you know, when I was coming out of the Kenny School or earlier. But I'm just going to finish with one point, which is a lot of this conversation can go around about me as an individual. It can be very me-centric. But actually, a lot of the stuff is actually, it's about we. You know, actually, the secret to a good life is community. I jumped over that, but it's like, it's your communities that actually is the ultimate driver of well-being. You know, if you want to get good work-life balance, we could spend hours on that. It's actually how you work with others. Individuals trying to do their own work-life balance is really hard. Sponsorship is about others. Your well-being is about others. You're giving gratitude, for example. Your networking is all about others. So as I think about success in my well-being in my life and success in my career, my orientation should be around the we, not just around the me. It's been great talking to you guys. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Grant. Great presentation, and thank you everybody for the questions. It's been, this is just one of a series of continuing education programming that we'll be doing. And I also want to thank Karen and her staff with the HKS Alumni Resources Office for helping us put this together, co-produce and put this on. And I look forward to seeing you at additional webinars in the future. And thank you so much for your commitment to the school. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all.